Good morning and welcome. I'm David DiBiase, an Associate State Director at AARP Virginia, and I'm here to provide a brief welcome message from AARP. We are thrilled to be working with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University to bring our members a sampling of the rich programs that they regularly offer. From our earliest beginnings, our founder, Dr. Ethel Percy Andrus, was a champion of lifelong learning. And I'll read you a quote from her. "The eagerness to learn, to pioneer in the development of new skills and new abilities, to broaden the personal scopes of understanding, to freshen the mind with new ideas and new concepts, and to achieve new heights of knowledge. This eagerness to learn has no age restrictions." Studies have shown that our brain is stimulated and can make new neuron connections and grows when we learn new things. So AARP encourages you to stay curious and challenge your mind by doing something that challenges your thinking, offers you enjoyment, and encourages you to grapple with new and complex ideas. It's never too late to discover a new cognitively stimulating activity. So with that, we say thank you for joining us. We applaud you for being here. I'll turn it over to Jennifer DeSano, the Executive Director of Ollie Mason. Jennifer, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, David, and welcome everyone to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at George Mason University. We've been around for 30 years, and we've been serving curious individuals to participate in lectures and classes, trips, and special events, as well as volunteer opportunities like teaching and serving on committees. There are many things that you can learn and do at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University. And I want to extend a welcome to all of our existing Ollie members who are joining us here today for this wonderful lecture, as well as those of you who are joining us across Northern Virginia and around the country through the AARP connection. You can do all kinds of things at Ollie, and we hope that you will check us out online at our website, olli, olli.gmu.edu to learn more. We are very happy to be collaborating with AARP to bring our wonderful speaker today, Ambassador John Lange. And to introduce Ambassador Lange is one of our very own Ollie program associates, Shannon Kim Morrow. Shannon.
Oh, thank you so much, Jennifer. And I'd like to welcome everyone to this talk this morning. I'm honored to introduce Ambassador Lange. Ambassador John E. Lange, retired, is Senior Fellow for Global Health Diplomacy at the United Nations Foundation, where he focuses on issues related to global health security and the work of the World Health Organization. He has held leadership positions in the Global Polio Eradication Initiative and the Measles and Rubella Initiative. From 2009 to 2013, he engaged in high-level global health advocacy with African governments while at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Lange had a distinguished 28-year career in the Foreign Service at the U.S. Department of State, where he was a pioneer in the field of global health diplomacy and a leader in pandemic preparedness and response. He was the State Department's Special Representative on Avian and Pandemic Influenza from 2006 to 2009. He also served tours of duty as Deputy Inspector General, Deputy U.S. Global AIDS Coordinator at the inception of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, and U.S. Ambassador to Botswana, which is where I know him from, and Special Representative to the Southern African Development Community, 1999 to 2002, where HIV/AIDS was his signature issue. Lange led the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, as chargé d'affaires at the time of the August 7th, 1998 terrorist bombing, for which he received the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award. Earlier, he had tours of duty at the U.S. mission to the United Nations in Geneva and the American embassies in Lomé, Togo, Paris, France, and Mexico City, Mexico. He has an MS degree from the National War College and JD and BA degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And with that, I'd like to say thank you so much to Ambassador Lange and turn it over to him. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shannon, and thanks to Jennifer DeSano of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and David DiBiase from AARP. I really appreciate your inviting me to speak today. As many of you will recall, I spoke to OLLI on the subject of COVID-19 and global health security last year on April 13th, but much, of course, has changed since that time. What I'd like to do today is first to briefly summarize some of the key events related to global health security that have occurred over the last 2 decades, and then to talk about the current situation, including the issue of vaccine equity and vaccine patents, and then describe nascent international efforts to improve pandemic preparedness for the future, including reforms of the World Health Organization, revisions to the international health regulations, and a proposed pandemic treaty. So to begin, I have to say my own experience with global health security came when I was with Shannon in Botswana. I was the US ambassador, and HIV/AIDS was the dominant issue. It was estimated when I arrived there that 38% of all adults aged 15 to 49 were HIV positive, just a disaster. And while that estimate was probably high, it was maybe 33%. It was clearly a huge issue. And in fact, the UN Security Council in January of 2000 even met on the issue of HIV/AIDS as a matter of international peace and security. And that was a time before antiretroviral therapy became affordable, and HIV/AIDS became a controllable disease for most. In terms of global interest in global health security beyond HIV/AIDS, the wake-up call really was from SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, which began in Hong Kong and elsewhere in China in 2003. And that really spurred the WHO international health regulations. Let me try to turn my volume up. I've been asked to do that. I hope that helps. And that really spurred the adoption of the WHO international health regulations, which were approved by the World Health Assembly in 2005 and went into effect in 2007. And they're really the bedrock of global health security. 196 countries have agreed to build their capacities to detect, assess, and report public health events. WHO plays the coordinating role, and together with partners helps countries to build capacity. IHRs also include specific measures at ports, airports, and ground crossings to limit the spread of health risks to neighboring countries and to prevent unwarranted travel and trade restrictions so that traffic and trade disruption is kept to a minimum. But they clearly were not adequate in this current situation with COVID-19. And so many people are looking at the international health regulations to see if they should be revised and improved. For one, they don't deal with countermeasures that are needed once a pandemic occurs. And for another, many countries didn't abide by their international legal obligation to build those capacities to detect, prevent, and respond to pandemics. In 2005 or so, bird flu, H5n1, became a concern. And that's when my own work on pandemic preparedness and response, separate from the HIV/AIDS issue, began because in early 2006, I was named the Special Representative on Avian and Pandemic Influenza, heading a task force in the State Department. And I have to say, this was a very concerted effort on the part of President George W. Bush's administration to prepare for a potential pandemic. There was a major effort on the part of the Homeland Security Council, now merged into the National Security Council, to build up the U.S. capability to respond to a potential pandemic. It turned out that H5n1 at least so far, hasn't mutated to become human-to-human transmission. It's still found mostly among poultry. But that was a real effort at pandemic preparedness that was undertaken by President Bush. There was a pandemic, I'm sure you recall, called H1n1 Swine Flu in 2009, 2010. Those of us who deal with global health security think that that almost did more harm than good, because the world concluded, oh, well, what's the big deal? It turned out to be a moderate pandemic, and it kind of fed into what those who work on these issues call feast or famine. When there's a concern for an infectious disease outbreak, the money pours in from governments, and then when it subsides, the money dries up. The Global Health Security Agenda was announced by the Obama administration in February 2014, and that was actually maintained by the Trump administration and now by the Biden administration. It involves about 70 countries trying to improve global health security. And it was announced about 6 months before Ebola really exploded in West Africa, 2014, in August. That has been a problem. Over 11,000 people died in West Africa at that time. More recently, it's been in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And in fact, WHO just announced that it had changed that it had stopped the current outbreak in DRC. There was also Zika fever in the Americas, 2015, 2016. And something very important to note, many of these diseases that I've talked about over the last couple of decades originated in animals. And there's such clear connections among animals, humans, and the environment. It's called One Health, and it's clearly a factor in trying to improve global health security. So all of this occurred over the last 20 years. We knew that there were likely to be more infectious disease outbreaks. No one thought that we had ended them all. And sure enough, COVID-19 began in late 2019 in China. It's all over the world. You know all about this. I don't need to go into all the details, but I think I'd like to just emphasize the global aspect of this. I'm not going to talk today much about the United States response domestically. I'd like to, at this point, quote the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. This is a board, a high-level board, convened by the World Health Organization and the World Bank. It's independent, and it's a monitoring and accountability body to ensure preparedness for global health crises. They've issued a couple of reports, and just on Friday, April 30th, the co-chairs called for the urgent mobilization of an international response to fight the surge in cases of COVID-19 that is occurring globally. They called it a new and very serious phase. And I'll quote here, "The number of new cases continues to grow, and hospitals and health workers in many countries are overwhelmed with oxygen and COVID-19 treatments in critically low supply. Healthcare systems are under extreme pressure. Some are close to collapse or have collapsed. The situation is beyond the capacity of the health sector to solve on its own. It requires a determined and collective political response. It is now a whole of society, a humanitarian, and a security issue. The virus knows no borders, and the disastrous situation is now threatening the whole South Asia region, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. The situation in South and Central America continues to worsen, and the continent of Africa is at grave risk of further waves as in South Asia. If the virus takes hold of very vulnerable regions with millions of displaced people in fragile or conflict zones, the world will face a public health and humanitarian disaster of unprecedented magnitude." So this is a warning from last Friday from this Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, chaired by the former Prime Minister of Norway and the former head of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. So what they did was they called on the UN Security Council, the United Nations, including WHO, to deal with this crisis and try to prevent it from escalating further. And they asked that it be put on the agenda of the upcoming G7 and G20 meetings, as well as other organizations. If we do not act now, this will turn into a world crisis, health social, and economic of historic proportions. That's the scary scenario that we're dealing with in terms of the global situation. Even though those of us based in the United States can feel a lot of comfort, I'm sure many of you have been vaccinated, I've been vaccinated, and it's a situation where the United States, because it has the vaccines available to it, is doing much better than the situation in many other countries, especially those that have had very little vaccinations because they have very little vaccine available. Now, internationally, there's a major effort going on that is meant to help low and middle income countries. It's called the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. It's nicknamed the ACT Accelerator. It's a groundbreaking global collaboration. I know sometimes people think that international organizations are very slow to move, but it actually came together very quickly last spring, over a year ago. And it's meant to deal with what they call pillars, 4 pillars of work: diagnostics, treatment, vaccines, and health system strengthening. Now, the one that you may have heard about most of those 4 pillars is COVAX, C-O-V-A-X. That's the pillar of the ACT Accelerator that is led or co-led by the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, C-E-P-I, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the World Health Organization. And they're working in partnership with developed and developing country vaccine manufacturers. It's the only global initiative that is working to ensure COVID-19 vaccines are available not only to higher income countries, but to lower income countries. And it has a very important goal to distribute up to 2 billion doses of a safe and effective vaccine to protect high risk and vulnerable people, as well as frontline health care workers by the end of 2021, reaching at least 20% of countries' populations in order to end the acute phase of the pandemic and help rebuild economies, but then to continue in a higher and higher percentage of countries' populations vaccinated. But what this raises is something that you may have heard about, really a fundamental issue that's kind of swirling around global health circles these days: vaccine equity. COVAX wants to ensure that 92 poorer countries will receive access to vaccines at the same time as 98 wealthier countries. But so far, it's shipped only 49 million vaccines to 121 countries that are participating. It raises a basic question: why should all adults in certain rich countries have the opportunity to be fully vaccinated before those in low and middle income countries, especially the frontline health workers and those at high risk? The Trump administration did not join COVAX. At the beginning of the Biden administration, the United States government pledged $4 billion to COVAX, but no vaccines. French President Emmanuel Macron has called on the US and Europe to back his proposal to share 4 to 5% of their coronavirus vaccine supplies with COVAX. The United States has not done so yet. President Biden addressed this issue, as you may have seen, in his April 28th speech to the joint session of Congress. He said, quote, "There's no wall high enough to keep any virus out. And our own vaccine supply, as it grows to meet our needs, and we're meeting them, will become an arsenal for vaccines for other countries, just as America was the arsenal for democracy for the world, and in consequence, influence the world. Every American will have access before that occurs. Every American will have access to be fully covered by COVID-19 from the vaccines we have." So he made it clear that the US will provide vaccines for all Americans who want them before giving them away, although there have been small amounts that have been given, like to Mexico and Canada and others. Now, I recognize fully that every sovereign nation has a fundamental duty to protect its own citizen, but you can argue that it's a moral imperative to provide at least some vaccines. As I said, President Macron suggested 4 to 5%, not just money, not just equipment, diagnostics and therapeutics, to those who are less fortunate in developing countries. But it's not only a moral imperative, in my view, it's in those rich countries' self-interest. The longer COVID-19 remains a global problem, the more likely variants will arise, and those can threaten everyone, since some of the vaccines may or may not work against those variants. And as international travel increases, a threat anywhere is a threat everywhere, including for those in the United States who are unvaccinated. The World Health Organization's Director General, Dr. Tedros, has called for vaccine equity. In January, he urged countries to work together in solidarity. And he said, quote, "The world is on the brink of a catastrophic moral failure, and the price of this failure will be paid with lives and livelihoods in the world's poorest countries." Not only does this me first approach leave the world's poorest and most vulnerable people at risk, it's also self-defeating because it will take the world economy longer to recover. He said, vaccine equity is not just a moral imperative, it is a strategic and economic imperative. Now, the a nonprofit organization, CARE, has issued a report, they released it on Friday, released on April 27, that details the economic rationale for a significant U.S. investment in a comprehensive global vaccination campaign. It's called The Case for U.S. Investment in Global COVID-19 Vaccinations. No one is safe until everyone is safe. And they did this based on an analysis done in partnership with the global consulting and technology company Booz Allen Hamilton. I understand the domestic politics here behind the administration's position to first provide vaccines to Americans, but I agree with those who call for much more generosity now toward developing countries as a whole. I do, though, expect this issue will recede, as President Biden implied, in the coming months as more and more Americans are vaccinated and the U.S. can more easily ship vaccines abroad. But alas, people will die in the meantime in those developing countries. There's another big issue out there as we're currently in the midst of this pandemic, and that is vaccine patents. So far, the United States and other wealthy countries, especially those who have their own vaccine manufacturing capability, have not backed calls to waive intellectual property rights for coronavirus vaccines so that generic vaccine manufacturers could produce vaccines for developing countries. There was a lead story that some of you may have read in Saturday's Washington Post. It described this issue as pitting Pope Francis, who backs the patent waiver proposal in the midst of a pandemic, against Bill Gates, who believes that research-based pharmaceutical companies need the incentives that patents provide for them to continue to do research and development now and in the future. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on Sunday said the U.S. Trade Representative has been engaged in, quote, intensive consultations, unquote, at the World Trade Organization to work through the issue of waiving vaccine patents. I know in a lot of global health meetings that I'm part of, there are people who love to bash the pharmaceutical industry, whereas I think you can describe their work in creating the coronavirus vaccines in record time as almost miraculous. It's just amazing what they've been able to do. And certainly patents gives them an incentive to do so. I certainly hope that there can be some accommodations on both sides in this one, and that much more manufacturing of vaccines for developing countries can take place in the months to come. So that was a discussion of the last couple of decades and then where we stand now on a couple of the key issues, vaccine equity and vaccine patents regarding the current situation with COVID-19. Let me talk a bit about the future, because you can argue that there are four important things for pandemic preparedness and response: community engagement, science-based strategy, effective communication, and global coordination and collaboration. Today, I'll be talking about the global collaboration. And international institutions are already in the midst of major efforts to learn lessons from COVID-19, even though it's still raging and we haven't learned all the lessons. They're already considering the necessary reforms. It was a year ago in May of 2020 when the World Health Assembly, which is the governing body for WHO, called for an impartial, independent, and comprehensive evaluation to review experience gained and lessons learned from the WHO coordinated international health response to COVID-19. That effort is called the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response. It's led by former President of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and former Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark. The independent panel will release its final report next week. Their progress report back in January had a basic message: the world was not prepared and must do better. At that time, they stated that public health measures which would curb the pandemic needed to be applied comprehensively. The pandemic response for COVID has deepened inequalities. The global pandemic alert system is not fit for purpose. There has been a failure to take seriously the already known existential risks posed by pandemic threats. And WHO has been underpowered to do the job expected of it. They said, and I'll quote here, the impact of this pandemic ought to provide a once-in-a-generation opportunity for member states to recognize the common benefit of a suitably reinforced suite of tools available to the international system to enable robust pandemic alert and outbreak containment functions. So it's really a situation where we do have, I believe, this once in a generation opportunity. And I'll talk a bit more about what some of those efforts are. The independent panel said they believe that the COVID-19 pandemic must be a catalyst for fundamental and systemic change in preparedness for future such events, from the local community level through to the highest international levels. A lot of people working on global health are very anxious to hear their report results, as I said, to come out next week. I believe it's expected on May 12th. Back in September of last year, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, and I quoted earlier their recent announcement, they issued the second of their annual reports, and they were actually very harsh in their assessment of the global COVID-19 response, warning that the world cannot afford to be unprepared again when the next pandemic hits. And they called for 5 urgent actions for the future to bring the order out of the catastrophe and chaos, as they put it, that the world is currently facing. Those 5 urgent actions were responsible leadership, engaged citizenship, strong and agile health systems for health security, sustained investment, and robust global governance of preparedness. Then there's the international health regulations that I mentioned earlier. 196 countries are party to them. They form the cornerstone of international public health and health security law. But high-level support and resources for implementation of those regulations has been insufficient over the years at both the national and international levels. It was under the auspices of the international health regulations that the Director General of WHO, Dr. Tedros, declared a public health emergency of international concern on January 30th of last year. And that is actually the trigger to say, hey, this is an international emergency. We need to act now. And it was the IHRs that provide for those declarations of public health emergencies of international concern, called PHEIC, P-H-E-I-C. But that drawn out and sometimes controversial process of deciding whether to declare a public health emergency has sometimes been criticized. So there's now a review committee also created by the World Health Assembly on the functioning of the international health regulations, and they'll soon issue their report. They've done a lot of consultations. I've participated in some of them, and they are going to recommend whether the international health regulations should be revised or not. In terms of the United States current posture and future posture, one of the most important documents that the new Biden administration put together was issued on January 21st. It was National Security Memorandum 1. It was called United States Global Leadership to Strengthen the International COVID-19 Response and to Advance Global Health Security and Biological Preparedness. National Security Memorandum 1 takes a whole of government approach. It looks at things globally from the health, diplomatic, and humanitarian responses. As you know from the bio that Shannon Moore read earlier, I'm not an MD. I don't have a master's degree in public health. I have a background in diplomacy, but there's a role for global health diplomacy, and that's included in this National Security Memorandum, so that the State Department, in addition to the Department of Health and Human Services and USAID and others, is very much involved in this effort. And it talked about concerns for this memorandum talked about concerns for food insecurity, gender-based violence, and disproportionate impacts on marginalized indigenous communities and women and girls that have occurred during this pandemic. And looking to the future, the memo calls for long-term measures to advance global health security and epidemic and pandemic preparedness, including through the Global Health Security Agenda that I mentioned earlier. It aims to reduce the risk of deliberate or accidental biological events, as well as the naturally occurring ones that, such as COVID-19, to combat antimicrobial resistance, which is a major concern as antibiotics become less and less effective, and to fight climate change as a driver of health threats. The section that begins that entire memo is called Strengthening and Reforming the World Health Organization. And that's another major issue that will be discussed at the upcoming World Health Assembly, how to reform and improve WHO in light of what we learned from COVID-19. And then on March 30th, over 25 leaders, heads of state and government and others, called for an international pandemic treaty to be adopted. They underlined the need to approach future pandemic response and pandemic preparedness with an all of government and all of society response. And when the World Health Assembly convenes in a couple of weeks, it is expected to consider a proposal put forth by the European Union and European Union members to consider a proposal to establish a negotiating mechanism for such a treaty based on the WHO Constitution. So we may very well see an international pandemic treaty being negotiated in discussions that the WHO Legal Council and the European Union representatives had recently with a group of civil society organizations. It's come clear that it could turn out to be a framework convention, which would be more easily approved and more quickly approved. And that would be along the lines of WHO's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And after a framework convention is approved, then specific protocols would need to be approved, and that would take longer in terms of the negotiations. So one of the things that may come out of this pandemic is an international pandemic treaty. A couple other developments that I should mention before concluding. Last Friday, April 30th, the United Kingdom announced it will host a summit in 2022 with the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, which I mentioned earlier, and that's really a leading scientific coalition. The goal is to raise funds for vaccine research and development to support the goal of cutting vaccine development time by 2/3 to 100 days, which could either avert future pandemics or at least mitigate them and save millions of lives. So that's another effort that's going to take place in a pledging summit next year. And then In a couple of weeks, on May 21st in Rome, the European Commission in Italy, as chair of the G20, will host the Global Health Summit. It's an opportunity for G20 and invited leaders of international and regional organizations and others to share lessons learned from COVID-19 and develop and endorse what they call a Rome Declaration of Principles. So there's a lot of activity going on looking to the future, because everybody knows that this COVID-19 has been a disaster and continues to be a disaster looked at globally. Let me conclude. In the modern world, every major threat and risk is globalized because the world is linked through travel, economies, and communications. This is not philosophical, it is practical and real. And in this situation, a multilateral approach to health is critical because each country by itself does not have enough control to manage the threat or risk by itself. COVID is a clear example. No nation is safe from a COVID-19 resurgence or a future pandemic until all countries have a much better ability to bring a pandemic under control. As I told many of you when I spoke to Ali in April of last year, we've had a lot of practice and a lot of warning signals over the last 2 decades. The world needs to have well-functioning and well-funded systems in place to prevent, detect, and respond to emerging infectious disease threats in a coordinated international approach. But while we currently do not have such a system in place, the international community, it seems to me, is now primed to take steps necessary to improve pandemic preparedness and response. In that cycle of feast or famine as to whether countries focus on the issue of global health security, we're in a feast situation where the attention there at the very highest levels of governments exists all over the world. The World Health Assembly, which will take place during the last week of May, will be grappling with these important issues: strengthening of the World Health Organization, improving the international health regulations, and whether to start the process for a pandemic treaty. I'm hopeful that these efforts will succeed and we will witness much improved global health security in the years ahead, but I also recognize it's going to be a long road. Thanks very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And we do have a couple questions. Panaria asks, now that India has dictated that it will not export any of its vaccines, any vaccines that it manufactures, which is a large percentage of global supply, how are we going to deal with the shortfall?
One of the largest vaccine manufacturers in the world is the Serum Institute in India, and with India not wanting to export vaccines for understandable reasons because of the terrible situation that they're encountering right now, understandable in terms of the domestic political situation, that can be a great concern. And I believe the head of the Africa CDC expressed great concern of what could happen in Africa. Trying to deal with the shortfall of vaccines is very difficult, and it gets back to the issue of whether the vaccine patents should be temporarily suspended or waived right now so that there can be more manufacture. If I were a vaccine manufacturer, one of those that had been approved, I would be doing all I could now to try to work with other manufacturers of generics, for example, in different parts of the world to try to have the vaccine produced because this is such a global concern. But in any event, it's a great concern, and it's not easy to deal with any of these shortfalls. As I said, I do think that the United States will be in a position to be much more generous than it has been in terms of vaccines, separate from the monetary contributions to COVAX in the months ahead, and especially since there are recent reports that vaccine demand in the United States is not as great as it was even a month or two ago. There are ways that countries will be able to try to help, but it's a very serious problem, at least in the immediate sense.
how do countries respond to the guidelines developed by the health bodies? Which countries have adopted the recommendations?
Yeah, I don't have the exact number, but there was a report that the countries who were parties to the international health regulations, that there were some studies done that indicated how few of them, less than half of them, have really met all the requirements. And that was based on self-reporting. What the Global Health Security Agenda did when the Obama administration initiated it and brought in the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health in 70 countries, what they did was to work with the IHR Secretariat at WHO to create joint external evaluations. And what these joint external evaluations did was they would look at countries and have external experts come in to look at the countries to see all various aspects of their global health security preparedness in terms of what's required under the international health regulations. And different elements were graded then on I believe it was a 1 to 5 scale, so that and some countries would have 5s but also have 2s, and it depended upon where what area it was looked at. And so it was really a mixed bag in terms of how countries were doing. Certainly the poorest countries of the world, and I heard a World Bank official once say that it was basically those that had under a $5,000 per capita income, spent the least amount of money toward that kind of pandemic preparedness and meeting the requirements to build capacities under the international health regulations. One of the main reasons to even create the Global Health Security Agenda in 2014 was to help those poorer countries to build their capacities. But it never had the money to be able to do that in a quick sense. It certainly needs more resources to be able to continue to build those capacities for the future. So it's very much a mixed bag. And on that subject, I have to say, as I quoted earlier, the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board called for strong leadership. But if you look at the leadership, you can look at almost every continent, and there's been a failure of leadership in one country or another on this. And as a longtime State Department diplomat, I have to say I'm not confident that the next time there's a pandemic in the years ahead, every country in the world will have strong leadership on dealing with the pandemic. It's just the nature of the beast, shall we say, that some countries have stronger leaders than others.
On that, building on that, we have several questions. How do we get countries who it either doesn't fit their political agenda or it doesn't fit their social agenda? How do we get them to embrace the World Health needs of a pandemic? Carrot and stick, what are the options?
There aren't a lot of sticks out there except for the requirements of the international health regulations, which is binding under international law, but it's not like a country can be taken to the International Court of Justice in The Hague to go to a trial because they didn't meet the legally binding requirements to build capacities under the international health regulations. Sticks really haven't worked very well. Some people are trying to come up with ways that where countries would be punished, but one of the main ways to deal with a country that isn't doing what it needs to do is by naming and shaming. There was a time under the previous president of Tanzania, Magufuli, who died recently, when he was not agreeing to share data with the World Health Organization, and WHO came out publicly saying they needed to share information. But it's very difficult. And in fact, the Director General of WHO is can be in a very difficult political situation, especially when he's dealing with some major countries that are permanent members of the UN Security Council or major contributors to WHO. It's just very difficult sometimes to even do that, the public criticism. So it's an imperfect world out there. It may always be difficult, but the idea of incentives is a better one, and creating, for example, public demand for vaccines, even in a country where the leadership may be skeptical of vaccines, is one way that can try to help a situation. I personally think that as vaccines demonstrate their efficacy, as COVID rates go down for those countries that have a large percentage of the population vaccinated, you will find that more and more countries are demanding even more vaccines, even those that have been a bit skeptical in the past.
How do we achieve equity and outcome when we can't even, the factors feeding into that, the age, the obesity, the underlying factors, the living conditions, how do we achieve that equity and outcome in preventing diseases?
Well, for all the reasons in the question, you can't really have equity and outcome because of certain things that, I mean, you can try to tackle obesity, but some people will still be obese, and that will have a problem in terms of the outcome. But the approach has to be, in my view, one that is more equitable, so that if it turns out that certain communities or ethnic groups are under vaccinated and more reluctant to take the vaccine, one should be working with various communications mechanisms to try to educate them so that they do get vaccinated. You certainly have countries, and I had experience living and working at embassies in West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, and you certainly have situations where some countries in sub-Saharan Africa will be dominated by one ethnic group or another. Well, the efforts to deal with public health have to be countrywide, can't be favoring one ethnic group or another. So you really need to be doing everything you can to recognize the diversity in communities, the diversity in ethnic groups, and approach it in an equitable fashion. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the outcomes will be equitable, because in the end, if you live in a place that it is very crowded, if it's a slum with very crowded conditions, social distancing may not be possible. You may find that the water and sanitation is a serious problem, which often fosters infectious diseases, etc. And the best way in the long run to solve some of these problems is just for all countries to have a much higher level of development, and that will take a long, long time.
Susan asks, how can we as U.S. citizens encourage and support our politicians and government officials to share our vaccines and therapeutic with poorer countries? Surely Russia and China will be seen as more generous.
They're currently seen as more generous. As I said, I'm not so sure that will be the description 6 months from now or 12 months from now, as I expect the U.S. is more generous in terms of giving vaccines. But right now, you can make a strong case that the United States is losing in this vaccine diplomacy effort, as it's often called, and that Russia and China are doing better. As far as citizens, I think you can always write to your congressional representatives about the importance of this and speak about it. There are efforts that the World Health Organization's WHO Foundation is doing. If you want to contribute money, the WHO Foundation is now trying to, and the UN Foundation, where I work as the fiduciary in the United States, to try to get money that would go to WHO and other international organizations for the response to COVID, and the WHO Foundation being to help WHO. But it's a very tricky one, and in terms of trying to get the U.S. to be more forthcoming. Clearly, President Biden himself, having raised this issue in his joint session of Congress speech, and all the others in the U.S. government who deal with these issues are well aware of the concerns about vaccine diplomacy and they're now struggling with how to meet both the domestic needs and how to be generous globally.
We had a lot of supply chain breakdowns early on. How do you envision supporting supply chains through countries, through the WHO, to make them more robust if something like this happens again?
That's a good question. I must say I've seen a lot of different discussions of reforms for WHO and changes for the future. Not as much discussion on supply chains. I'm sure people out there are doing it, but I haven't seen it myself. The thing about supply chains is they tend to be private. And one of my concerns actually is that the world will conclude that they have to be prepared to fight the last war, that they have to be prepared for another COVID-19. And we'll have stockpiles of personal protective equipment and various other things that can occur that can be needed in the midst of a coronavirus vaccine pandemic. But maybe the next pandemic or epidemic, if it's not as global, will be of a different nature. And so you really need to look at this in terms of an all hazards approach that goes even beyond an infectious disease outbreak. As I said, the US government's National Security Memorandum 1 talks not just about a naturally occurring disease, but also about accidental or deliberate releases of a biosecurity agent. You can think of the anthrax attacks that occurred in September of 2001, shortly after 9/11. And those were deliberate. And I've been a member of a committee at the National Academy of Sciences that looked at those biosecurity threats. And the interesting thing is they're dealt with not just by the health community, but also by the defense community, even though those communities often don't talk to each other. But when you're trying to deal with these infectious disease threats from naturally occurring, deliberate, or accidental releases in labs, you end up having many of the same responses, no matter which community is dealing with it. On specific to the supply chain, though, if you end up having a supply chain, trying to improve the supply chains, I'm sure countries will be looking at this, and a country like the United States can provide incentives so that these supply chains are much shorter and even include either the United States as the base of manufacturing, or maybe it's the three countries in North America that are together on their trade agreement, Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So there should be improvements in supply chains as time goes on, but I don't really know how to predict how that will come out. Because you can look at the situation in India right now. There are scarce supplies for vaccine production that are hurting them in terms of their own ability to create more vaccines in their urgent situation. It's just in this globalized world, it's going to be a very tricky issue. And I do not see it being done in a real sense by the World Health Organization, because so many of those supply chains are in the private sector. Or maybe governments themselves will engage on it, but I would be surprised if WHO becomes directly involved in trying to deal with them. It may be more involved on the policy side, trying to ensure equity in the way those supply chains operate, but I doubt that it will be involved in the specifics of how those supply chains work.
Okay, you mentioned 5 actions for pandemic response to COVID-19. Can you say again who proposed those 5 actions and elaborate on this a bit, like global preparedness?
Yes, the 5 actions that I mentioned, 5 urgent actions, it was the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board. And they actually said this back in September 2020. If you want to look at kind of a depressing document, look at their September 2019 report, the first report prepared by this Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, because that talked about the urgent need for the world to be prepared for a potential pandemic. And sure enough, it started a few months later. But in their second report in September 2020, they called for these 5 urgent actions. This is a board chaired by Gro Harlem Brundtland, who's the former Prime Minister of Norway and former Director General of the World Health Organization, and by Asi, who's the former head of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And they called for these 5 urgent actions, I'll just repeat what they were: responsible leadership, engaged citizenship, strong and agile systems for health security, sustained investment, and robust global governance of preparedness. What I like about this board is that it's beyond WHO, because, and you maybe would expect this coming from a retired diplomat instead of a public health expert, I really see this whole issue of pandemic preparedness and response as requiring that whole of government, whole of society, whole of United Nations approach. It's not just a technical matter for health experts. And I can see this in other ways, in other diseases even. As you heard from the introduction by Shannon Morrow, I have had a leadership role in the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. We're down to 2 countries that have polio, wild polio virus, to be specific, endemic, Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the program, GPEI, is having difficulties in those countries, not because it doesn't know how to put 2 drops of oral polio vaccine into a child's mouth. That's not the issue. They can do the technical side of things. The health experts are terrific at that. The problems in those 2 countries, in many cases, have to do with conflict and with access to children who have been unvaccinated. And what is the issue there? In southern Afghanistan, it's trying to operate in Taliban-controlled areas. That's not a health issue. That's a political, diplomatic, humanitarian security issue. So I look on these the future of global health preparedness and response, and more broadly global health security, as having to involve those other sectors of governments, and having to really be not just multi-sectoral within governments, but all of society from the community level on up. And that's why this Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, it brings that in, because it's co-convened by the World Health Organization and the World Bank. And the people who head it, as I said, come from that broader background. So it really, I think, should be looked upon in the future as really a major element in this whole effort to try to improve the global health security architecture. Now, I don't want to take anything away from the independent panel that is about to release its report, but that is meant to be a short-term effort, and I don't know if they will issue another report following the one that they issue next week.
Okay, tying on to your polio, did giving away polio vaccine patents impede innovations by pharmaceuticals?
I don't know if I'm not aware that the patents were given away for polio vaccines. Because after a while, a certain number of years, when the patent is no longer in existence, they are no longer applicable, and generic manufacturers can do it. Although I do believe that one of the vaccines, I can't remember if it's the Salk or Sabin vaccine, the Salk or Sabin decided not to even ask for a vaccine a patent. But I don't think that's a necessarily applicable example in terms of the polio vaccine as it would apply now, and in terms of whether if one would waive the patent now for COVID-19 vaccines, if that would be a disincentive for R&D. But one could hear entire lectures on the subject of big pharma's vaccine patents. As I said, I think they did heroic work to create the vaccine that they did, the different vaccines that are working now. It's just amazing what they've done. But at the same time, there have been occasions in the past when they've greatly irritated some people who work on global health. And in fact, there was a time when President Nelson Mandela of South Africa was very critical because there was a great need for HIV/AIDS antiretroviral drugs back in the 1990s, and great need for them to be affordable, and it took a while for that to take place. There can be some very controversial issues out there regarding vaccine patents, and we're in the midst of one of them.
And Pat asked, what was the role of government in financing the COVID vaccine development?
Yes, under Operation Warp Speed by the Trump administration, there money did go for various vaccines. I don't have all the specifics in front of me, but it was prepared for it was given to various vaccine manufacturers to the processes, which certainly is one of the factors one would think in terms of whether one would who should have control over these patents, whether that was built into the initial grants from the government as to who would control it, and now in terms of whether those patents should be waived. It's an important factor.
How do you view quarantine as a tool for future pandemics with our people who don't like being told you can't move around, but countries that were truly able to quarantine fared better in this pandemic?
I haven't done the study, but I wouldn't be surprised if someday there's a study in which it's shown that the countries that had less open governments, more authoritarian governments, were able to defend better during this pandemic than others. The United States, one of its beauties is, of course, it's the land of the free, and so we have people who don't want to be quarantined or kept inside. There are other issues related to that. For one was closing the border. When we were working on the potential of an H5n1 pandemic back when I was in the State Department, 2006 to 2009, as the special representative on avian and pandemic influenza, there was a study done for the White House that showed that if the U.S. were to close its border upon the knowledge that an infectious disease outbreak with pandemic potential had begun in another country, the estimate was that, based on the modeling, that this would give us about a 1 week advantage, because we really can't close the border fully. It just wasn't going to work. And if you can look at what the Trump administration was able to do at the beginning, when they didn't want to have people flying in from China, but they did allow Americans in who may have already been exposed. And there's been some criticism about whether those who greeted the Americans were exposed to the potential of the virus. Should Americans be allowed to return home if they're ill because they get better medical care? There are all kinds of issues there that arise, and it's just very difficult to close the border and have it be effective. This is such a globalized world. We just can't think of ourselves as this island that can keep everything else out. Now, you can look at New Zealand, and they've done a better job in this because they do have that advantage, of course, being an island. It just to me, it kind of shows how messy these issues are, and we can learn lessons from them. But that doesn't mean that in the future they will be easily adopted, because there are so many different aspects of this. And is it worse to have everyone shut down and have some businesses go bankrupt, or is it worse to keep things open and have more people die? I mean, there's just so many incalculable determinations that need to be made that I think the world is on a path to improve global health security through the means that I mentioned. I don't think we'll ever be totally secure from in that sense, because of the difficulties in making some of these decisions.
what is the bottleneck for basically flooding the world with the necessary vaccine? Is it the patents, the manufacturing process, or the distribution supply chain?
All of the above. Patents is one of the issues, but the manufacturing process is huge. And in fact, there's some talk about planning for the future to try to have the manufacturing capabilities on standby. But to my knowledge, you can't really do that with, and you can't just build a state-of-the-art plant, which can cost hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, and then just leave it sit for years and years. It has to be kept in operation at a certain level to be effective and available. So there's so manufacturing capacity right now is one of those issues. And you can just look at what happened to the Baltimore plant of one manufacturer when they had to throw out vaccines because of improper processes were used and the vaccines were not therefore usable afterward once they were created. These things are not easy to do. So that's another aspect of it. And then there's the distribution of it. And I'm, having lived, as I said, in sub-Saharan Africa for much of my foreign service career, I'm concerned that once vaccines are readily available in many African countries, they may not have those distribution processes in place. That I may be wrong on that, because actually those countries have a better public health system for purposes of what is called routine immunization, or the essential immunizations that a child needs to have. Those systems are already in place. They're meant for children, but it's much easier to convert a system like that through public health units in the most rural areas. It's much easier to convert that to include adults than if you don't have the system at all. I don't know about any of you folks, but when I went to get vaccinated, it was in a whole new area that was never before had been used. It had to be specially set up. And in fact, when my daughter went, she had to go to a shopping mall in an abandoned department store to get vaccinated. In many of the countries that have strong systems of immunization for their children, they already have systems in place and maybe can use those same systems at the health units themselves. So that may not be as much of a problem in some of those countries. But again, there are many issues here, and the vaccine patents, the manufacturing capability, and the vaccine distribution all are of concern in one way or another.
Okay, we have questions about the Cuba vaccine. What do you know about it, and are they sharing it?
I do not believe that it has been approved by WHO in their emergency use listing. That's very important for developing countries to use the vaccine. Very few countries want to use a vaccine that hasn't been approved by WHO for their emergency use listing. I don't believe the Cuba vaccine is on that list, but I don't really know much about it. It hasn't been discussed anywhere near as much as some of the others, including from Russia and China, as well as the big ones that you're all aware of. Meg, any more?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm looking back through the questions to see if I've missed any. I have a question statement here that says that some companies such as Pfizer didn't take the money from the government to develop their vaccine. Do have more people gone on their own?
Well, in some respects, I would say that the discussion these days, not only in the United States, but in Europe and elsewhere, of the vaccine patent waivers and the fact that the World Trade Organization is involved to discuss whether these the patent waivers should take place, and the efforts by some global health leaders to urge that that these waivers be put in place is separate from whether the money that the pharmaceutical company put toward creating their vaccine came from the U.S. government or other governments. Because the way this is being framed is we're in the middle of one of the worst pandemics ever. It's not as bad as it was in 1919, I called the Spanish flu, but certainly in most of our lifetimes, this is a terrible pandemic. And if you don't give patent waivers in the middle of that, when would you do it? So the issue isn't really whether that can be dealt with in terms of if you got U.S. government money, can the U.S. government dictate whether you waive the patent in this situation? But really, in the global discussions, it's more a matter of this is an emergency. We need to produce as many vaccines as possible. The world will never be safe until all countries have been able to put COVID-19 behind them, or at least brought it under control. We have to, as quickly as possible, get these vaccines to everyone in the world, or at least every adult in the world. And that's where that discussion comes from. So it's not really so specific to Pfizer and some others as to whether or not they got money from the U.S. government.
Okay. What do you think the next pandemic will be, and where do you think it will begin?
I'm not a good person to ask for that. When we were working on pandemic preparedness under President Bush, there was great concern about Indonesia. And the reason was that you had poultry from this H5N1 virus. They were dying in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Thailand, in Egypt, in Nigeria, etc. And I went to all those countries actually, but the biggest concern was Indonesia. And in fact, Indonesia knew that that was a concern, and their health minister, Minister Supari, ended up having a great concern at that time that they would be sharing the viruses that once human-to-human transition occurred in a sustained, and the WHO Global Influenza Surveillance Network expected them to quickly and freely share that virus with WHO collaborating centers, including CDC. And then the fear that Indonesia had was CDC would give the virus to a vaccine manufacturer. The manufacturer would create a vaccine against this virus, thought to be bird flu. And the last in line to receive the vaccines would be Indonesia, even though the virus came from Indonesia. And that was a concern that Indonesia had. And we ended up in negotiations. I led them for 2 years, and they lasted 4 years to finally come up with a pandemic influenza preparedness framework. Much of this entire concern came about, as I said, because the focus on Indonesia. Well, the pandemic from the H5N1 bird flu virus. And instead, when the pandemic did occur in 2009 and then 2010 from the H1n1 swine flu virus, it started in Mexico and was quickly in California. So it's very hard to predict where these things will start. If it comes from an animal disease such as HIV/AIDS, maybe it comes from Africa, or like Ebola did. It originated in Africa, but we don't really know. And it can be the wet markets where the freshly killed animals freshly killed, and then the meat is purchased from the wet markets, etc. There are just so many complications here because so many human diseases have come from the animal kingdom. So the one thing is, I don't know when it will occur. I don't know where it will occur. I don't know where it will originate from. The only thing I will say with certainty is we'll have another pandemic. I just don't see any way, no matter how much effort the world puts into increasing global security, I don't see any way to prevent these infectious disease outbreaks from happening, these emerging diseases, but we them much more quickly and much better in the future by improving global health security. So part of the effort is to prevent pandemics, but part of the effort is also to mitigate pandemics.
Okay. Is the technology of RNA vaccination from Pfizer or Moderna versus the AstraZeneca older tech of creation sign that future vaccines will combat diseases in different ways? And what innovations and vaccines are out there to be considered in the future?
Yes, I'm not the technical expert in this, as you know, but it's extremely promising what these vaccines have been able to do, and one can hope. Back when I was working on pandemic influenza preparedness, there was talk of what we really need is a universal influenza vaccine, but that was talk in 2006, and it's still the talk today, and we don't have it. Recently, there's been some talk we need a universal coronavirus vaccine, but that will take a long, long time to produce. But those would be of such great benefit in the long run. Maybe, who's to know, maybe 50 or 100 years from now, we really have come up with these universal vaccines that can be applicable, and we have been able to prevent future pandemics. And one can hope that that's a potential scenario, but I don't see it happening anywhere in the immediate future because of the complications of this. But I'm not the expert on the technical aspects of the future of vaccines, but I'm also confident that the US government and other governments will be pouring money into the National Institutes of Health and others to try to come up with some of these efforts for the future.
You mentioned Indonesia as a potential hotspot. As with most things, it's the cover-up that causes us so many problems. Is there a way to use being promoted on the vaccine list, a way to get countries to say, oh, we have a problem here early on, instead of trying to sweep it under the rug?
That's a very tricky issue. There's even an effort out there called the Pandemic Mitigation Project that's trying to propose a treaty in which countries would agree in advance to accept teams coming in to investigate a potential infectious disease outbreak that could be of international concern. And if they don't agree, that then there would be some efforts to punish them. But how do you do that punishment is very tricky. When we were working with Indonesia back in a dozen years ago, and there was this concern, there was really a concern that if it happened in Bali, their major tourist destination, they'd maybe be more inclined to try to cover it up than if it happened elsewhere. There was all this concern about China, and it's still left out, and the World Health Organization Director General has said more efforts need to be done to review what actually happened in China. Were they open about this earlier on? Some countries are more inclined to cover things up, and it's just very difficult to come up with the incentives. And the world, the way the world operates is, I don't predict through all of these efforts, whether it's through strengthening the international health regulations or through other efforts, I really don't think you're going to find a system whereby countries will agree that they will be punished in some significant way if they don't, if they aren't transparent, if they aren't forthcoming as soon as these disease outbreaks occur. It's very difficult. And time is such it's so important in these kinds of these situations. It's really of the essence. When we were doing our modeling on H5n1 with Indonesia, we ended up with looking at Indonesia and others, the idea was if you didn't catch this in the first 7 to 14 days, when there was hope that antivirals could be used in kind of a ring fence around the immediate area where it had started, if you didn't catch it in those first 7 to 14 days, maybe 21 days maximum, it was lost, and a global pandemic would take place. But the problem is, if it's in some remote area and it started, it often isn't even known to the authorities in the capital, and the slowness of processes tend to make it very difficult to try to control these and stop these in one country or another. Well, I've really appreciated the opportunity to talk to you, and as I said, I'm actually very hopeful that we're in the middle of some major changes in terms of the global health security architecture. It will take time to figure out what those are. Certainly negotiations of an international pandemic treaty will take time. I would expect it at least a year and maybe many years. As someone who really, since I arrived in Botswana in 1999, worrying about HIV/AIDS as a health issue and a security issue, I must say, as someone who's been following it for so long, I'm very pleased by this high level attention, and hope we can really take advantage of it to make sure that if we look in the future, and if there's a pandemic 5 or 10 or 20 years from now, we will be able to say that the pandemic preparedness and response was much better than it was for COVID-19, because the world really did improve the systems in place and provide the funding for those systems. So let's hope for the future. Thanks for inviting me.